Rivers are a really big deal. If you look at human history, some of our earliest civilizations were founded on the banks of great rivers because they provided fresh water, fertile land, and an easy way to transport and trade. Even to this day, many of humanity's great cities can be found on those same rivers, such as the city I grew up in, which has 3 rivers, none of them great. In fact, the city is also not great. The same is mostly true for Middle-earth, so in this video I'm going to talk about every single river in Middle-earth. So, to give this video some structure, I'm going to go from west to east, and after talking about a main river, one that flows into the sea, I'm going to talk about that river's respective tributary rivers. Some rivers don't have any known tributary rivers, whereas some, like the Anduin, have something like 12. Some of these tributaries are so small that they don't appear on the map. I will also mention nameless rivers, but we don't really know much about them. Our first river happens to be a nameless river. This one can be found in Lindon, in the northern part known as Forlindon. This river has its source in the western side of the Blue Mountains and runs down to where the smaller elven haven of Forlond is situated. This river might also be one of the newest rivers in Middle-earth because according to our maps of Beleriand, it didn't exist in the First Age, and therefore could only have been created after the destruction of Beleriand. Our first proper named river is the River Lhun, the Blue River. It has its source in the far north of the Blue Mountains and runs all the way down into the large Gulf of Lhun, passing through where one can find the main elven port city of the Grey Havens. The Lhun has 2 known tributaries, the Little Lhun, which also comes down from the Blue Mountains, and an unnamed second tributary which comes down from the hills of Evendim. While the River Lhun may have existed in the First Age, it probably changed quite significantly following the destruction of Beleriand. Historically, the Lhun was actually quite important. During the War of the Elves and Sauron in the Second Age, it was where the Elves and the Númenóreans managed to hold Sauron's forces after he conquered the rest of Eriador, and in the Third Age it's where the Dunedain of Arnor found safety after the Witch King destroyed their kingdom. Our next river is one of the most well-known rivers in Middle-earth, the Brandywine, the Golden Brown River, or as it was known to the hobbits of the Shire, the Brandywine. The Brandywine flowed out of Lake Evendim, where Annúminas, the ancient capital of Arnor, was built. The river then flowed south, marking the eastern border of the Shire and Buckland. It then flowed through the depopulated lands of southern Arthedain and Minhiriath, before flowing into the Great Sea just north of the forest of Erin Vaughan. The river had 3 known crossings at the end of the Third Age, the Buckleberry Ferry, the Brandywine Bridge, and Sarn Ford. As the border of the Shire, the Brandywine played an important role in its defence, and on the occasions it froze over, it allowed enemies such as white wolves to enter. The Brandywine had a number of tributaries, and although some of them weren't that small, none of them appear on the map. We have the simple The Water, which ran through the central Shire, including Hobbiton. We have the Stockbrook, which starts near Woody End and is responsible for the marsh called the Marish. There's the Shireborn, the boundary of the South Farthing, which had a tributary of its own called the Thistlebrook. There's the Withywindle, which runs into the Old Forest, and is where Old Man Willow attempted to drown Frodo. And finally, there's the Norborn, which can be found in the North Farthing. The next major river is the Gwarflow, the Greyflood. Being fed from the Misty Mountains, the Gwarflow formed the border of Minhiriath and Enedwaith, or historically Arnor and Gondor. The river officially began where Tharbad was built, at the confluence of the Glanduin and the Mythythel, near to the marshland known as the Swanfleet. This is the only known way one could cross the river. After that, the river ran down to the Great Sea, where the ancient Númenórean haven of Lon Dare and Ned was built. Beyond forming the border between kingdoms, the Greyflood was incredibly important historically. It was where the Númenóreans began their first forays into Middle-earth, and later it was where Sauron was defeated at the climax of the War of the Elves and Sauron. The river was also prone to flooding, and late in the Third Age, this resulted in the destruction of the old town of Tharbad. While the Greyflood was fed from the Misty Mountains, the rivers that started there were considered different rivers. The northernmost one was the Mythythel, or the Hoarwell. It started near to the Etten Moors and formed the border between the Troll Shores and the Lone Lands east of the Weather Hills, and as it ran further south, it formed the boundary of the ancient kingdoms of Rhudaur and Cardolan. It absorbed the River Bruinen around this point, and then ran into the Swanfleet where it would become the Greyflood. The last bridge was built over the Hoarwell, which saw plenty of traffic over the Third Age, migrating hobbits, Thorin's company, and later Frodo and his companions. The river that fed into the Hoarwell was the Bruinen, the Loudwater. It actually began as two rivers, flowing down from the High Pass, and the southern stream was the one that flowed through the valley where Rivendell was located. The point where these two streams met was where the Ford of Bruinen was located. This is the place where the Nazgul were swept away while pursuing Frodo. Historically, the Bruinen was the eastern border of the successor kingdom of Rhudaur, as the lands beyond were always considered elven country. The third river that flowed into the Greyflood was the Glanduin, the Border River. It started just to the south of Moria, and as the name suggests, it formed the border between Eregion and Dunland. It then flowed down into the Swanfleet, where it joined up with the Hoarwell to form the Greyflood. The Glanduin actually had a minor tributary of its own, the Saranen, the Stream of the Gate. As this name suggests, this stream began near to the doors of Moria. Sometime in the late Third Age, before Balin's expedition, someone had dammed the river, and as a result it was mostly dried out, and a dark pool had formed at the west gate of Moria, hiding the Watcher in the water. Our next major river is the Angren, the Iron River, and more commonly known as the Isen. As you might expect, the Isen's source was in the mountains above Isengard. It then ran south and then west, first forming the border between Rohan and Dunland, and then being the southern border of Enedwaith. There were two known ways to cross the Isen, at Isengard itself, and then at the fords of Isen. Beyond the fords, the river became deeper and faster moving, and increasingly difficult to cross. As the border between Rohan and Dunland, the Isen saw plenty of activity through the late Third Age. Interestingly enough, a Corsair fleet even landed at the mouth of the Isen during one of these conflicts, the furthest north known foray of those pirates. The Isen had one tributary, the Adorn. The name is of pre-Númenórean origin, and therefore there is no known translation. The Adorn came down from the west of the White Mountains, and together with the Isen, it formed a triangular-shaped piece of land known as the West March. Officially, this land was part of Rohan, but its lords and people had plenty of Dunlending blood, and had a habit of siding against Rohan. One such of these lords was Freka, who actually had a fortress at the source of the Adorn. Our next river is the Lefnui, meaning fifth, because it was the fifth of Gondor's 5 main rivers going from east to west. Coming down from the White Mountains, the Lefnui officially formed the western border of Gondor, as the lands beyond were never properly settled by Gondorians. Apart from that, due to its remoteness, not much happened at the Lefnui, except that Corsairs did raid as far as that river, and even landed a fleet there at one point during Umbar's wars with Gondor. Our next major river is the Morthond, the Black Root. It began in the White Mountains, in the same valley where one could find the entrance to the Paths of the Dead. From there, it ran southeast, being joined by the River Ringlo near to the Great Sea. At the mouth of the river was the ancient elven haven of Ethelond, which was abandoned by the end of the Third Age, and beyond the mouth was the small bay known as Cobas Haven, which Dol Amroth overlooked. Centered around the River Morthond was the Gondorian fiefdom of the Blackroot Vale, which was renowned for its skilled archers. As I just mentioned, the river that flowed into the Morthond was the Ringlo, the chill water, because it was cold, I guess. Not much else is known about the Ringlo, except that it could be crossed at a place called Ethring, and it was where the small Gondorian fiefdom of the Ringlo Vale was located. The Ringlo had a small tributary of its own, the Kirill, translation uncertain. The Kirill could be crossed at the town of Calambel, which was located on a hill overlooking the river. Our next major river, although to be fair, I'm not sure how major it was, is the Serni, one of the 5 rivers of Lebanon. Its name has something to do with pebbles or stones. It formed the border between the Gondorian regions of Belfalas and Lebanon, and was the location of the town of Linhir, where the river could be crossed. But while the Serni was the river that flowed into the sea, it was much smaller in length than its tributary, the Gilrain, another of Lebanon's 5 rivers, and another which also has a strange name, something to do with spark and spray. Flowing down from the White Mountains, the Gilrain was the main source of the Serni, the other being a random spot in the middle of Lebanon. Legend has it that while heading south to Ethelond, the elf maiden Nimrodel became enamoured with the Gilrain because it reminded her of the river in Lothlorien that shared the same name as her. Our next river is none other than the Anduin, the greatest river in the northwest of Middle-earth by far, which is actually what the name means. The Anduin was fed from multiple mountain ranges, the White Mountains, the Ethelduath, the Misty Mountains, but its main source is considered to be the Grey Mountains. From the Grey Mountains, it ran south and was the focal point of the Vales of Anduin, both that in Rhovanion and that in Gondor. After passing through the ancient Gondorian capital of Osgiliath, the river widened and eventually flowed into the Bay of Belfalas. The Anduin had a number of unique geographical features: the Carrock, the Undeeps, the Falls of Rauros, and the delta at the mouths of Anduin. The Anduin was also responsible for feeding the marshlands of the Gladden Fields, the mouths of Entwash, Nindalf, and even the Dead Marshes. Historically, the Anduin was by far the most important river in Middle-earth, and especially south of Rhovanion, it practically separated the west and the east. By the end of the Third Age, it formed the eastern border of places like Rohan and Gondor, and played an undeniably important role in protecting both of those kingdoms. Despite its great size, the Anduin only had a handful of known crossings: the Carrock, the Old Ford, the Undeeps, Caer Andros, Osgiliath, and the mouths of the Anduin. Protecting those crossings was often vital to Gondor and Rohan's survival, and the War of the Ring saw the first time where those crossings were effectively lost to the west. As I mentioned earlier, the Anduin had many tributaries. The first of these were the main sources of the river, their names being the Greylin, which flowed down from the Grey Mountains, and the Langwell, which flowed down from the Misty Mountains. Both of these rivers were named by the Aethiod, the ancestors of the Rohirrim, and at the confluence of these rivers is where they built their old capital, Framsburg. Historically, these two rivers also formed the eastern boundary of the eastern portion of Angmar, which existed beyond the Misty Mountains, but this enclave ended following the arrival of the Aethiod. The next river is the Rimdaff, meaning the Rushdown, which flowed down from the Misty Mountains. Going by its names, one might assume that it was a steep, fast-flowing river. It is not named on the map of Middle-earth. Further to the south, in the central vales of Anduin, was the Ninglor, the Goldwater, which is an apt name because it is more commonly known as the Gladden, and the nearby marshland of the Gladden Fields was where Isildur was killed and the One Ring was lost. Many years later, the hobbits known as the Stores settled on the banks of the river, and it was there where Deagol found the One Ring, only to be murdered by Smeagol shortly afterwards. The river was then searched extensively by Saruman, and while he never found the One Ring, he did find Isildur's remains. The next river to flow into the Anduin was the Celebrant, the Silverlode, which started at a stream in the Dimril Dale just below the legendary lake called the Mirrormere. From there, the Silverlode ran east, passing straight through the middle of Lothlorien, and then emptying into the Anduin. The Celebrant was not alone though. Just as it entered Lothlorien, it was then joined by the Nimrodel, which also began in the foothills of the Misty Mountains. The Nimrodel was probably named after the elf maiden of the same name, or she was named after it, who disappeared on her journey to the west alongside King Amroth of Lothlorien. The next river to flow into the Anduin was the Limlight. Beginning somewhere in the forest of Fangorn, the River Limlight then flowed east, emptying into the Anduin near the shallows known as the North Undeep. Historically, the Limlight was incredibly important. It formed the northern border of Gondor and later Rohan. Just north of the river was the field of Celebrant, where a decisive battle of the same name was fought between Gondor, joined by the Aethiod, and the Balkoff Easterlings, joined by Orcs of the Misty Mountains. A feature that played an important role in that battle was a bridge that had been built over the Limlight by the Gondorians, and as I discussed in another of my videos, that bridge probably saved Gondor. South of Emmenmuil, the Anodlo, or the Entwash, flowed into the Anduin, resulting in the inland delta known as the Mouths of Entwash. As you might have guessed, the Entwash also started in the forest of Fangorn, and drinking the Ent drought that came from that river could have some unforeseen side effects, such as making one taller. In Rohan, the river formed the border between the Eastmark and the Westmark, and it could be crossed at a place called the Entwade. Historically, the river played a part in the defense of Rohan. During the long winter, an army of Easterlings bunkered down in the Entwash Vale, but come spring, the snow melted, and that resulted in flash flooding that wiped out many of the Easterlings. The Entwash was fed by two other rivers, both of which were quite important. The first was the Snowbourne. This was a river that flowed down from the White Mountains, and it was very much the heart of Rohan, passing by Edoras itself. The other tributary was the Mering Stream, or the Glanhir, both meaning Boundary River. This river came down from the beacon hill known as Halifirion, and as decided by Steward Kirion and Aeol the Young, it marked the border between Rohan and Gondor. In later years, the Gondorian side of the Mering Stream became ever more deserted, whereas the opposite happened on Rohan's side. Our next river is a river with a sad history. It was probably once known as the Ithilduin, meaning Moon River, but by the end of the Third Age it was known as the Morgulduin, the Black Magic River. The Morgulduin began in the Morgul Vale, where Minas Morgul could be found, and then flowed through Ithilien, entering the Anduin south of Osgiliath. The Morgulduin was toxic. It sounded cold and cruel, drinking from it would poison you, and even breathing in its vapours would make you sick. We're not sure if this toxicity continued beyond the Morgul Vale, but there's no evidence of the Morgulduin corrupting the Anduin. Our next river brings us back to Gondor. This is the Erawi, simply meaning alone, the first of Lebanon's 5 rivers. This is a very small river flowing down from the White Mountains through the fiefdom of Lossarnach before entering the Anduin. But despite its small size, the Erawi was the site of an incredibly important battle fought between King Eldacar of Gondor and Castamir the Usurper. This battle was fought at the crossings of Erawi, and although Castamir was killed, the death toll was high and the rebellion was not ended there. The next 2 rivers are the second and third of Lebanon's 5 rivers, the Sirif, meaning flowing, a great name, and the Kelos, roughly translating to water falling out swiftly from a rocky spring, an even better name. Both rivers began in the White Mountains, the Kelos flowing just a short way before meeting up with the Sirif, the main river. From there, the Sirif flowed south into the Anduin, and it was at the confluence of these 2 rivers where the important port city of Pelargir was built by ancient Númenorian colonists. The final tributary to the Anduin was the Poros, translation unknown, and along with the Morgulduin, one of only 2 rivers to flow into the Anduin from the east. Like the Morgulduin, the Poros had its source in the Ethelduath, but unlike the Morgulduin, there is nothing to suggest that the Poros was poisonous. Historically, the Poros was incredibly important. It formed the border between the Gondorian regions of Ithilien and Harondor, and after Harondor was lost, the border between Gondor and Harad. At least 2 major battles were fought at the river, both of which were Gondorian victories. However, as Gondor weakened, so did their grip on Ithilien, and before the War of the Ring, the Poros was uncontested. The last river to flow into the Great Sea was the Harnen, the Southern River. Starting in the southern Ethelduath, the Harnen flowed a long way to a great mouth in the southern Bay of Belfalas. Not much is known about the river, except that it could be crossed at the Harad Road. Historically, the river was the border between Harondor and Near Harad, and was crossed several times by Gondorian kings who were seeking to defeat the Haradrim. At the height of Gondor's power, the Harnen formed much of Gondor's southern border, and beyond it were Haradrim tributary kings. However, as Gondor waned, the Harnen fell out of reach of Gondor's rulers, and by the end of the Third Age, it was deep within Haradrim territory. We're not done yet, because the Great Sea was not the only sea that rivers flowed into. In the north of Rhovanion, the Celduin, the River Running, had its source at Erebor, and from there it flowed all the way to the Sea of Rhun, making it one of Middle-earth's longest rivers. The Celduin was a river of trade. It was used by the men of Dale and Esgaroth, the dwarves of Erebor, the elves of Mirkwood, and the inhabitants of Dorwinion to send goods up and down the river. Historically, the river was the northern border of the Northman Kingdom of Rhovanion, the northern border of Dorwinion, and later the southern border of the Kingdom of Dale. Through the years, it also served as a bulwark against Easterling invaders from Rhun. The Celduin had major tributaries of its own. One of these was the Carnen, the Redwater. It flowed down from the Iron Hills, probably how it got the name, the Redwater, and it met with the Celduin a little over halfway in its journey towards the Sea of Rhun. The Carnen was the eastern border of the Kingdom of Dale, and was the place that separated the Westlands from the vast region of Rhun. During the War of the Ring, a large army of Easterlings invaded Dale by crossing the Carnen. The other major tributary to the Celduin was the Forest River. Yep, you can tell that name came from The Hobbit. The Forest River came down from the Grey Mountains, passing through Mirkwood, separating the woodland realm from the rest of the darkened forest. It met the Celduin at the Long Lake, where the town of Esgaroth was built. The river was also heavily used for trade. Some of Thranduil's subjects, known as the Raft Elves, would use the river to get their goods to the men of Esgaroth. The Forest River had a tributary of its own, the similarly hobbitly named Enchanted River. The Enchanted River flowed north from the mountains of Mirkwood, meeting the Forest River at the rough location of Thranduil's Halls. The Enchanted River was enchanted, but not in a fun way. The water was pitch black, and coming into contact with it would cause one to fall unconscious for as many as several days. Thus, the river was normally only crossed using boats. The reason for the enchantment is unknown, but given the river came down from the mountains of Mirkwood, a place that was inhabited by evil creatures, it's possible that it had something to do with Sauron's dark magic. But we're not done yet, for we have a few more rivers, but fortunately they're all nameless and all in the same place, so I'm going to talk about them all at once. These are the unnamed rivers in Nurn, Mordor's southern region. There are 4 of them, 2 flowing from the Ethelduath and the other 2 flowing from the Ered Lifwi, and all 4 of them flowing into the salty inland sea of Nurnen. What these rivers are like is unknown, but given Nurn is Mordor's breadbasket, it's probable that at the very least, these rivers contributed to the fertility of that region. Thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting, and I hope you aren't going to throw yourself in a river after watching this. Like I said in the intro, I grew up in a city with 3 rivers, but none of them are overly big. I could easily swim across them, provided I don't get eaten by a shark. But I finally became aware of great rivers when I was pissing into the Rhine while drunk one night and thought, damn, if I fell in, this thing is wide and fast flowing, there's a good chance I might drown. Unfortunately, I did not fall in. Cheers, farewell, and remember, rivers aren't even that interesting.